On the subject of anthrax, everything we heard amounted to results of no interest whatsoever.
I brought no new scientific elements? Really, sir?
Pasteur is happy to trot out generalities which naturally change nothing for the topic itself. Pasteur is not even a doctor.
You hadn't even cut your teeth in science when I was concentrating on isolating and growing microbes in a pure state.
A fresh epidemic gave them the first opportunity for a confrontation in the field. In the summer of 1883, cholera threatened Europe. The outbreak began in Egypt. The whole Nile Delta was infected, the disease killing some 500 people a day. France, as the colonial power, had to play a leading role. A mission was set up in Alexandria on the 15th of August. Now aged 60, Pasteur did not join the trip. He put the mission in the hands of his disciple, Émile Roux. On the other side of the Rhine, the German government entrusted Koch with a similar task. The German led his delegation in person when they arrived in Alexandria on the 24th of August.
Dear Emmy, I arrived here yesterday. It is hot but bearable. I went to bed after midnight, and we were at work at 5 a.m.
Nous en avons trouvé un qui est mort ce matin.
Et vous êtes sûr que c'est le choléra, Gafki?
Absolument.
The epidemic will not last much longer. Fortunately, we quickly found someone who had died of cholera to begin our analysis.
C'est bien. Faites-le transporter en salle d'autopsie, Gafki. Au travail.
D'accord, docteur.
So far, we are all in good health. May that continue.
Oui, c'est une nouvelle lettre d'Égypte.
Ah.
Qu'est-ce qui se passe?
C'est Tulier. Il est...
Mon Dieu.
Il fut gai toute la journée. Et à 3 heures du matin, il se sent très mal et entre dans la chambre en criant « Roux, je me sens très mal ». Et il tombe sur le plancher. Nous avons cru à une indigestion à 8 heures du matin. On peut le considérer comme mort.
This was a total disaster for him. He blamed himself and felt guilty. That said, he had given them a whole host of instructions not to take any risks. Despite that, poor Tuilier, who he held very dear and who was a gifted and brilliant student with much promise, died at the age of 26.
Mr. Koch and his team came over as soon as the news spread across town. They found the most touching words for the memory of our dearly departed.
This was quite a surprising episode in the relationship between Koch and Pasteur. The death of Tuilier created a sort of truce in their confrontation.
These gentlemen brought 2 wreaths that they themselves nailed to the coffin. They are modest, said Mr. Koch, but they are made of laurel like those given to the glorious.
As the epidemic petered out, the source of the cholera remained a mystery.
J'en ai la confirmation, les Français sont partis ce matin.
Oui, et on ne trouve plus un seul cas.
But Koch refused to give up. He had a lead in the shape of a bacillus found in the gut.
Ça sert à rien de rester, il n'y a plus rien ici.
He wanted to pursue his research in a place with cholera.
Vous pensez à quoi? À l'Inde? Vous croyez...
1 month later, he arrived in India with his assistants Gafki and Fischer. As soon as he arrived, Koch made a crucial observation. Whereas Pasteur thought cholera was passed on by air, Koch and his team understood the key role of water. he noticed how each time the locals washed their clothes soiled by cholera in sources of drinking water, the sickness spread. The doctor continued his hunt for the agent responsible. And 3 weeks later, he sent a triumphant communique to Berlin.
I can conclude that the bacillus found in the gut of infected patients is indeed the pathogenic bacillus behind cholera. We have identified what differentiates its bacteria. The bacillus is in the shape of a comma.
With tuberculosis and cholera, Koch had identified the two most deadly microbes in the world. In May 1885, he was appointed professor at the Institute of Hygiene in Berlin. His fame now equaled that of Pasteur. The Frenchman even lagged behind the German, since he had made no major discoveries on human illnesses. It was time for him to take on a scourge that struck terror into the heart of man, passed on by the bite of a dog, fox, or wolf: rabies. The symptoms of rabies are terrifying. Hallucinations, convulsions, a phobia of water, savage behavior. Once infection is confirmed, certain death follows. There is no treatment. Rabies wasn't, however, a priority. It only led to a handful of fatalities a year, nothing in comparison to the thousands who fell victim to tuberculosis. But it had one feature that Pasteur found very interesting.
Rabies begins with a bite. Then the wound heals. Nothing happens. Then 2, 3, 4, sometimes 6 months later, the disease appears.
This time lag changed everything. Unlike the vaccine for smallpox or anthrax, which must be administered before infection by the disease, with rabies, one could vaccinate a victim who had already been bitten and head the disease off. The vaccine would also be the remedy, a potentially spectacular breakthrough. But Pasteur faced a problem he had not dealt with before. The microbe was invisible. It was, in fact, a virus, much smaller than bacteria, and impossible to see with microscopes of the day.
Dans ce cas, est-ce que nous pouvons commencer?
Pasteur therefore had to work by deduction. After weeks of trials with his disciple, Dr. Roux,
Vous me mettez sur la cage?
he succeeded in vaccinating a dog, then a second one, and then more.
Et on en est à combien de chiens?
Eh bien, depuis le début, on peut dire que 40 ont été vaccinés avec succès.
On y est, héros. N'est-ce pas?
Je suis pas sûr, monsieur.
Louis!
C'est encourageant, mais...
Oui, tu es là? Louis! Il y a une dame qui est là avec son fils. Elle a traversé tout Paris pour te voir. Son fils a été mordu. Je lui ai dit que tu ne pouvais rien faire, mais elle insiste.
Tu sais bien que je ne suis pas prêt.
Je lui ai dit, mais va au moins lui parler. Elle est désespérée. Elle est venue d'Alsace pour te voir.
Alsace.
On était dans l'expérimentation.
This was animal experimentation, but the passage from experiments on animals to experiments on human subjects, scientifically speaking, should have been a long way off. There wasn't sufficient testing to switch to any trials of treatment on a person.
Alors, qu'est-ce qui t'est arrivé, mon bonhomme?
Je me suis fait attaquer par un chien.
Le chien était enragé. Il s'est jeté sur lui, docteur.
Je ne suis pas docteur, madame. Ou examinez-le, s'il vous plaît.
Monsieur, on dit que vous soignez la rage.
Oh, soignez? Non, madame. Non, nous essayons de vacciner pour empêcher la maladie de se déclarer.
Mais de toute façon, le vaccin n'est pas prêt.
Mais on dit pourtant que vous vaccinez des chiens.
Oui, madame, comme vous dites, ce ne sont que des chiens.
Monsieur Pasteur, je sais ce que c'est que la rage. Je vous en prie, vaccinez-le.
Ce n'est pas si simple, il y a des risques.
Il y a même de très gros risques, madame.
Alors vous n'allez rien faire?
Comment t'appelles-tu? t'appelles-tu, mon bonhomme?
Joseph, monsieur. Joseph Meister.
It's hard to imagine what Pasteur, who had lost 2 children to infectious disease, might have felt before this boy who was perhaps doomed to die if he didn't act. It's hard to imagine the anguish he may have felt. It had worked with dogs, but there was no guarantee it would work on a human.
Roux was firmly against it. Roux was a doctor, and it was he who performed the injections. On top of this, he'd written his thesis on rabies, so if he could challenge Pasteur on anything, it was that.
Non, c'est trop risqué.
Vous avez vu ces morsures. Si on ne prend pas le risque, cet enfant va y passer.
Oui, mais même si le chien est enragé, c'est pas sûr que le petit soit infecté.
Ce qui est sûr, c'est que s'il est infecté, il va mourir, oui ou non?
Oui, monsieur.
Et vous voulez le laisser mourir? Qu'est-ce que vous direz à sa mère si on ne fait rien?
Oui, si on échoue. Ce sont des dizaines d'autres gosses qu'on pourra jamais sauver.
Mais je sais bien, Roux. C'est un risque, un gros risque, mais... Vous êtes jeune. Vous pouvez attendre. Moi, je ne peux pas.
Meister had been bitten 48 hours previously. If the disease was present, it would not be for a matter of weeks, which left plenty of time to test a vaccine. And what's more, he was Alsatian. How could this be overlooked for Pasteur with his fierce hatred of Germans? He had the boy examined by 2 doctor acquaintances, Vulpian and Granchet, who confirmed the bites were serious. Meister was no doubt contaminated. Almost secretly, Pasteur took the plunge.
Le docteur Granchet va te faire une première piqûre au ventre. Ça va faire un petit peu mal, mais c'est nécessaire, tu comprends?
Je vais essayer de pas pleurer.
Tu sais, si tu pleures un peu, ce n'est pas bien grave. Mais il y en aura d'autres, tu le sais, ça?
Plus que 10?
Un petit peu plus. Alors on y va, Joseph?
For 2 weeks, Joseph was injected with nerve tissue infected with weakened rabies. Each day, the dose administered was increased, so his body would become accustomed to it. But one doubt remained. What if Meister did not have rabies? How could they prove the vaccination had worked? That was the aim of the 13th and final injection.
He needed that crucial test. And at the end of the treatment with Joseph Meister, he injected him with rabies.
At the end of the course, he had him injected with totally virulent nerve tissue, which would have given Meister rabies if he had not been protected by the previous injections.
For him, this was the validation of his theory. But you can see why today this type of treatment would be unacceptable.
Tu as réussi, Louis. Tu l'as sauvé.
My dear friend, I think something amazing has occurred. Joseph Meister came out of the laboratory. The child is in fine health this morning. He has a good appetite and no longer has any fever. One of the great medical feats of the century is underway.
This time, Pasteur was sure of himself. He could repeat his exploit, this time giving it maximum publicity. He chose to vaccinate Jean-Baptiste Jupille, a shepherd boy who was bitten saving his friends from a rabid dog. It was an ideal story to promote his vaccine. In the following weeks, people came from around the world to be vaccinated in Paris. Faced with such success, the Academy of Sciences opened an international subscription to found an institute. Pasteur was a hero. At the end of 1889, Professor Koch shut himself mysteriously into his laboratory.
Professeur, vous avez besoin de quelque chose?
He was hoping to pull off a major coup. He had resumed his study of tuberculosis, the bacteria which made him famous. Only now, he wanted to take the next logical step and find a remedy. If he could find a cure for tuberculosis, that would far outstrip what Pasteur had done with rabies.
Tu es en forme?
After several months, Koch had obtained some promising results, having cured some guinea pigs infected with tuberculosis.
Tu es même en grande forme.
Koch was confident he was on the right track. But the most celebrated scholar in Germany was under great pressure to come up with results. On the 4th of August, 1890, the 10th International Medical Congress was held in Berlin. Koch was to be the star. The Kaiser wanted to show the world the superiority of German medicine and was counting on a major announcement from his champion. Koch knew his findings were only partial. He had yet to do any human trials. But pressed by his superiors, he took the plunge.
Chers confrères, je suis très honoré d'être parmi vous aujourd'hui.
He gave a presentation on microbiology in general, but right at the end, in the last 2 minutes, he dropped a bombshell.
J'ai trouvé plusieurs substances capables d'entraver le développement du bacille tuberculeux. Des cobayes qui en ont absorbé sont restés réfractaires à l'inoculation tuberculeuse.
Koch was still very prudent at that conference. But he was considered a very serious scientist, meticulous and precise. So everyone thought if Robert Koch said something, there must have been much more to it.
Messieurs, je vous remercie de votre attention.
Bravo! The conference attendees were in doubt. Koch had found a cure for tuberculosis. Tuberculin, as Koch called it, was presented by the press as the greatest discovery in the history of humanity. Sick people flocked to Berlin from all over the world to be treated. The government built a research establishment along the same lines as that built for Pasteur. Robert Koch would have his own institute. In Paris, some voiced their reservations about this miracle cure. Pasteur himself silenced the critics.
Il n'y a rien à dire, c'est une grande victoire. Il faut le féliciter. Et d'ailleurs, nous devrions déjà réfléchir à la production de vaccins.
But Robert Koch had jumped the gun. After hundreds of people had received injections, the initial results were disastrous.
It quickly became clear that tuberculin was actually harmful and that the sick who received the treatment suffered more from tuberculosis than those who received nothing.
Robert Koch was in a tight spot.
On ne peut plus rien te dire.
Fiche-moi la paix.
Tu as changé, Robert.
His fall from grace was not yet over. As his triumph turned into a fiasco, events in his personal life further tarnished his image. Koch was now spending more time at the theater than in his laboratory.
Vous êtes venu ce soir encore?
Vous étiez encore mieux qu'hier, Edwige.
The renowned professor, now 48, came to watch Hedwig, age 17.
Pour vous, ce n'est rien du tout.
Mais un homme comme vous.
Koch divorced Emmy, whom he had known since childhood. 2 months later, he caused a scandal marrying Hedwig Freiberg, 29 years his junior. While Koch wallowed in disgrace, Pasteur was at the height of his glory. To mark his 70th birthday, the French president, Sadi Carnot, brought together some 4,000 prestigious guests at the Sorbonne. But Pasteur's health had deteriorated rapidly. Supported by his son Jean-Baptiste, he made his last public appearance. Since their first skirmish 20 years before, Koch and Pasteur were no longer the same men. Pasteur no longer left his room. Koch traveled the world with his young wife. The rivalry between the two researchers was now continued by their disciples. It was a contest between two institutes, two teams. An outbreak in China of one of the most feared diseases, bubonic plague, provided the backdrop for one final battle between their respective followers. It was one of Pasteur's men, Alexandre Yersin, who discovered the bacillus responsible, just beating the Japanese researcher Kitasato, a disciple of Koch. This came as a final satisfaction for the Frenchman. On October 5th, 1895, a state funeral paid tribute to a hero of science. Louis Pasteur had died a few days earlier at Marne-la-Coquette.
Profoundly moved by the universally felt loss of the wonderful founder of the Institut Pasteur, the Berlin Institute of Infectious Diseases shares in the sense of grief. Robert Koch.
Robert Koch was 20 years younger and continued his travels with his wife. He obtained one of the first Nobel Prizes for medicine. In 1904, he came to Paris for the first time and paid a visit to the Institut Pasteur. The followers of his former rival welcomed him as one of their own. He died in 1910, aged 67. After Pasteur and Koch, medical science entered a new era. Henceforth, diseases were no longer defined by their symptoms, but by their causes. Epidemics diminished, and life expectancy made its greatest jump in history. The chemist and the country doctor had become national icons, so much so that one often forgets that the work of Louis Pasteur would perhaps not have been the same without the research of Robert Koch, and vice versa.